yeah, people just sort of moved on. I think partly because they didn't feel like they had any choice from moving on. They knew that it wasn't going to be taken seriously. What benefit would there have been in getting upset about that? They're used to being ridiculed and mocked and not taken seriously. Why would this be any different?
Nicky Woolf is a journalist and podcaster who investigates fringe internet culture. A former writer at The Guardian US and editor of The New Statesman, Nicky also created and hosted the 2021 podcast Finding Q, My Journey into QAnon, as well as the 2023 podcast The Sound, Mystery of the Havana Syndrome. For his newest podcast, Fur and Loathing, he investigated an unsolved 2014 chlorine gas attack on the world's largest furry convention. To those unaware, a furry, basically, is a person who creates an animal avatar, either online or in the outside world, many of whom construct elaborate costumes of their character. For this episode, Nicky takes me through the case of this terrorist attack, shares his experience spending time at a recent furry convention, discusses misconceptions and urban legends about this vibrant community, and discusses a dark subculture that lurks at the fringes of this otherwise inclusive and colorful world. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. I'm so excited to welcome Nicky to the show. I think this is going to be truly interesting. So welcome, Nicky.
It's good to be here.
So I want to start by asking you, before we get into the projects you've been working on, will you tell us all a little bit about what you do in general that kind of led you to the work that, you know, we're going to be talking about today?
So I was a print journalist. I was with The Guardian in New York and then San Francisco for a long while and covered American politics before then. I wrote a long read about the guy who ran the website 8chan in 2018 or 19, something like that. And I'd always had a specialty in weird internet shit, where the internet hits politics and how it affects kind of general life. So that did mean that I covered an awful lot of mass shootings and had to read an awful lot of horrendous manifestos.
Ah, yes.
But it gave me a weirdly front seat view to how this new communications infrastructure, this whole big internet thing, was bleeding over and then pouring over into the world of politics. And obviously that led up to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. But it was something that I'd been seeing and watching happen for years before that. And then after I wrote this profile of this guy, Fred Brennan, it's a really interesting character. I like Fred a lot, actually. He was the founder of 8chan and then ended up being caught up in this whole QAnon nightmare situation. And so I got asked if I wanted to turn that long read into a podcast after it became clear how big an effect QAnon was having. And I said no. And the editor, this guy, Kerry Thomas, said, why don't you give it a try? So I made a podcast called Finding Q, which was really great fun to make, and made it with a really good team. And then after that, I'd sort of found myself in this podcasting world. And actually, writing for audio, I found really fun, because writing for print, especially for newspapers, you're writing a very, very specific kind of way. Mm-hmm. I was writing for audio. I found I was writing for my own speaking voice, and I found that very, very rewarding and very fun to do. And so I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to explore the next weird story and the next weird stories. And then the one I did after QAnon was this thing called Havana Syndrome. We made a podcast called The Sound. And that was a super weird story about diplomats getting sick in Cuba. And there's lots of thought that it could be some kind of sonic energy weapon or microwave energy weapon, or that it could be completely psychogenic. So we looked into that. I'll be very happy if for the rest of my career I don't have to engage with the CIA ever again. I don't think a government department has ever lied flat out to my face before.
Well, they're famous for it, I think, in this country, yes.
Right, yeah. It's part of what they do, right? It's not surprising. And then a story that I'd been wanting to do for a really, really long time I was able to say, why don't we do this one next? And I guess this leads us into the show that we're talking about here, but it was a terrorist attack, not to beat too much around the bush about it. People called it all sorts of different things at the time. No one seemed to take it very seriously. But it was a chemical weapon terrorist attack. It was actually one of the largest in American history on a furry convention in Illinois in 2014. It's remained a cold case. It's remained unsolved. And we linked up with this fantastic blogger, this guy called Pacho Fur, who's a blogger within the furry community. And we can, I guess we'll get more in detail about what the furry community is. And yeah, we sort of found that actually the more strings we pulled, the more yarn came out. And so we ended up on this crazy journey.
Okay, so I've got to listen to the first 2 episodes. We're recording this back in May. So for all of you lucky listeners out there, the show is either completely finished or getting close to being finished. And in it, you talk to a lot of different people who are furries, who go to these types of conventions and who live their life in this manner, at least part of their life. So that's just a little background as well for our listeners. But would you tell me how you stumbled upon this story and why you just had to eventually run with it the way that you did?
So I've been aware of furries as a community. And do you want a little potted definition here of furries with that?
Yeah, let's do it.
So furries are a subculture. It's a type of cosplay, really. So cosplay is sort of dressing up, costume play, essentially. And a lot of cosplay is to do with existent IP. So you get something like Comic-Con, where the cosplay is, you're dressing as Disney characters, Marvel characters, this kind of thing. Furrydom is a cosplay that's self-contained. There is no corporate IP that people are dressing up as. Fundamentally, at its core, it's people who like to create these costumes and dress up with and inhabit the personas of cartoon-esque animal characters. And it's a much maligned subculture. For a long time, people have, and the media has to take a lot of responsibility for this, they get portrayed as either kind of sexual deviants who, I've just realized you can't see me, but I'm doing a lot of the little bunny ears with my fingers here, but like sexual deviants who identify as animals. And now that's completely untrue. No one is believing they're an animal here. It's about play and it's about artistry and it's about costume making. There is a sexual element to the fandom. I think it's possible to oversteer completely the other way and sanitize it too much, but no more than there is at Comic-Con or another kind of fandom like that. And this story, when the attack happened, I was actually working at The Guardian at the time. I was on a weekend shift. And I watched it play out in real time. And this was, so 2014, obviously, Twitter and the internet was well established. And so I saw it happen kind of in real time. And I wrote a story about it for The Guardian. Well, I say wrote a story. I did what's called retopping a wire. So I've gone back and checked what I actually wrote about it. And my byline isn't even on it, which is frustrating.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I watched this play out. I watched the confusion on social media as people were evacuated from the hotel. They were evacuated about 1 a.m, just before 1 a.m. No one knew at first what was going on. There was lots of confusion and fear, and people knew that they'd smelt some kind of gas. And what had happened was that someone had set off a chlorine gas bomb, essentially. And, bomb is a kind of catch-all term. The way the device was actually built was it was 2 glass containers taped together that got thrown and smashed in the emergency exit stairs directly underneath the air conditioning intake system. So someone planned with quite a lot of specificity where to set this off that would cause the most chaos, if not the most harm. And the police just sort of woofed it. Like, no arrests were ever made, no charges were ever made, no official suspect was ever announced. The only thing that the police said at the time with any certainty was that it had been an intentional act. And that's where things just sort of stood for almost 10 years. And so I sort of descended in on this and thought, maybe we can move this along a bit. Maybe we can figure out who might have been behind it and why.
And I mean, it seems like from what I've heard so far, the police were not interested in solving this story. And I think I don't think it's hard for our listeners to imagine why that might be, and why the cops wouldn't take anything having to do with furries seriously. But I am curious about your experience either hearing about the police work or speaking potentially with officers, and what the general feeling was about furries, this convention, as well as the crime.
So there's a few very interesting things that we ran up on, all happened kind of at the same time. So from the outside, it very much did look like the police just didn't take it seriously. It happened in a very strange town, this place, Rosemont, Illinois, which is kind of not to say a fake town, but a township that's legally self-contained, even though it's a suburb of Chicago. But it has its own police, it has its own fire department, and these are small departments. The town is run essentially by one single family, the Stevens family. This attack happened at part of the convention center. It happened at the Hyatt, but across the road is the Donald Stevens Convention Center. Mayor was Donald Stevens III, who'd taken over from Donald Stevens I. The police chief had been Donald Stevens II, and then was taken over by a guy called Bradley Stevens.
Wow.
Who was the youngest police chief in the country at 29 when he took over. So it's not your normal police department. And then the FBI quite quickly got involved. A lot of slightly strange stuff happened around the evidence, we think, because, again, this unorthodox police department were the first on the scene and maybe didn't necessarily know exactly how to deal with a hazmat evidence gathering situation. Certainly, there were a lot of fuck-ups made during the investigation. One of the first things that happened was that when the materials were taken to the lab and first tested, the machine used to test them was incorrectly calibrated. So none of that evidence ended up being usable, which I think must have played a huge role in why the case wasn't able to go forward. But one of the things that we discovered, we had a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests out. One of the things that we discovered was certainly on the FBI side, there had been beneath the surface a lot more going on with the investigation for a lot longer than anyone had publicly thought or known before. So the last time the FBI, along with the Rosemont Police Department, were knocking on the door of a suspect was 2019.
Oh, wow.
So there was more going on. We're no longer at the point where we can say they just completely dropped it. I don't think that's the case now. They did make some screw-ups. The reason 2019 is interesting is that we think they were trying to get something over the line before the statute of limitations ran out.
Oh, yeah.
It was complete news to me that there's a statute of limitations on a terrorist-adjacent offense. We've spoken to some former FBI people who say that it probably would have been in a different category had anybody actually died. There were 19 hospitalizations, including an infant, which puts it in quite a high category. But I think for it to have hit a terrorist offense that would have overcome the default statute of limitations, if someone had died, that would have changed that. So we think they made a real effort to take something over the line just before the end of that statute running out and failed to do so. But the other thing is how unbelievably secretive, even now, both the police and the FBI have been about this investigation, to the point where we have not, at any point in this podcast, no official from the FBI was cleared to sit down with us, and no comment at all was made by the Rosemont Police Department.
Wow.
Which is unusual for a case like this. And there's some speculation we've heard from some insiders that some of the people involved might be confidential informants. There's a lot of people with links. Once the rabbit hole starts to go down, there is subgroups within furries of alt-right adjacent and kind of Proud Boys adjacent groups. It's not out of the question that some confidential informant development might have been going on there, which would be one way of explaining why the FBI haven't played ball with us at all. Although it's worth saying someone at the FBI played ball because we got all of these FOIA documents back.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot we don't really know how to read in terms of how the official investigation went, because they're still incredibly secretive about it, more so than even the FBI would usually be about something like this.
That's really interesting. And I guess I am glad to know that it's being taken more seriously than it maybe seemed. So you went to a furry convention. You went to the actual convention center where this occurred. And, not only did you check out the scene of the crime, but you also checked out the scene that was this furry convention. So for our uninitiated listeners, could you give us just paint us a picture of what it was like for you to be there and all the different things that you did?
It was, I have to say, fabulous. It's the first thing that was striking was the scale of it. There's 15,000 people at Midwest Fur Fest the year that we went, 2023, which is quite a lot more than there was in 2014, the year of the attack, where there was still about 4,500 people.
Mm-hmm.
It is this kind of sprawling, it's so visually overwhelming. Everyone is in these stunning costumes. And to get a sense of what a costume furry outfit looks like, imagine a sort of somewhere between an old school Disney cartoon animal and a sort of Japanese anime style. Big eyes, bright colors, big ears, these kind of huge costumes, fur. And then there's subgroups. There are dragons, which are called scalies. There are all kinds of things like that. And everyone is just having this unbelievably beautiful kind of innocent play experience. The furry fandom leans queer friendly, leans kind of neurodiverse friendly. There's a lot of people who are not necessarily out in any kind of way in their ordinary kind of day-to-day lives, for whom these kind of conventions are just, you can leave all of your inhibitions at the door and just go and have a purely innocent time of play and inhabiting these very playful characters. And it's just impossible for that not to be infectious. And a lot of people who only really know each other through the internet, people who know each other through kind of VR chat and through these kind of groups, it's their only chance to meet in person and to see all these friends in person. And it was such a joyous experience. And that really contrasted with how dramatic an attack was made against this community. But it was such a fabulous experience, but exhausting. I mean, absolutely knackering.
Would you tell us some of the events? I loved hearing about like you were looking at the schedule of events, and it just was it just sounded really fun.
It was so much fun. There were lots of kind of video game stuff. There was a Beyblade tournament. There was one which I didn't manage to get it into the episode, but my very favorite event was a kind of review of short films that had been made in VR chat.
Oh.
And they were so just adorably janky. I mean, the characters would be sort of clipping in and out of the walls and stuff. And some of them were kind of gaming themed. There was all kinds of in-jokes that I hadn't even the beginning of a way of understanding. And then just sprinkled in among them, there'd be these heart-rending tributes to someone who'd passed away, or just an I miss you from kind of across large kind of distances. And I was just an absolute wreck by the end of it. It was the most intense emotional roller coaster experience, but I thought was just staggeringly beautiful. And then there's lots of artistry. There was workshops on how to make fursuits, how to get fursuits commissioned. A fursuit, to get a full professionally made fursuit, we're talking $15,000. I mean,
15. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, more if you go for the top artisans.
Yeah.
And there were kind of workshops on how to get the attention of one of those artisans to even get one commissioned. And the level of artistry that goes into them is extraordinary. They really are just beautiful pieces of artwork. And then there's lots of artwork around that. There are people who do drawings of people's fursonas. Your fursona is the furry persona. And then there were adult events. There was one of my producers, ended up at the Bad Dragon stand in the artwork shopping stalls area. Now, I don't know if Bad Dragon is something that's going to be familiar to you or your listeners, and I'm not 100% sure I would recommend Googling it.
It's not familiar to me, so I don't know.
It's
your call if you want to talk about it.
I mean, I'm assuming you have it. So they're magical animal themed sex toys.
Okay.
Of some, and I think Ian was quite struck by the size of some of them.
Oh, okay. All right.
But yeah, so there's adult stuff and adult artistry stuff going on as well. But it's very much the minority of meetups for specific kinds of furries, featheries, scalies, There was one meetup specifically for skunks. But yeah, everything under the sun. And we're talking hundreds of events over the course of the day over this ginormous convention center. There was so much. You couldn't begin to see even a tenth of what was going on.
And I know that you also got to attend or at least witness what sounded like a really rockin' rave.
Oh, yeah. The convention culminates on the Saturday night with this huge party. And there's the rave in the main dance hall area. And then every room is a little breakaway party, having inviting all their friends up, carrying all, huge amounts of booze and maybe other things going on. And that was on the Saturday night. And it was the Saturday night in 2014 when the chlorine device was set off. So it was at the time when people were at the most vulnerable, I guess. It was the time when you would set something like this off in order to hurt as many people as possible.
So while you were visiting the convention, which sounds so fun, by the way.
It was so great.
You also had to kind of do this weird contrasting thing where you investigated where this device or, bomb, for lack of a better word, was set up and set off. So could you tell us about what it was like to do that and just a little bit more about what the, quote unquote technology was behind that bomb?
So to paint you a picture of the geography of the place, when I'd first reported this story and first been following this story, I'd imagined just like a classic hotel, like corridors, rooms off the corridor. This hotel is a weird, brutalist kind of masterpiece thing of a building. It's shaped like a medieval castle with turrets at each corner and then a huge space in the middle that's just wide open. So the rooms are off walkways around the sides, and then the elevators go up the middle. Sky bridges connect them. It is an MC Escher fever dream.
Okay.
Very strange space. But so we walked through we had from the foyer docs, we had the printout of the report from the first responders, and we followed their steps. And they came up the elevator, and the detail that hadn't jumped out when we first looked through it, they came up the elevator, and as soon as they stepped out the elevator, the chlorine detector pinged. Now, that in a closed corridor, I thought, sure, like that's where the gas spread. As soon as we got into this space, it became suddenly clear that meant that the chlorine had to cover this huge space in the middle of this hotel, so the elevator banks in the middle of the atrium. So seeing that kind of geography of where this had happened completely changed my view of what exactly had went down, because it would require so much more gas to cross that gulf than it would to spread in an enclosed kind of room, more classically laid out hotel. And so walking through it, it was like being transported back to the night. And I kept trying to imagine what it was like. These are big sky bridges over a 9-story gulf with quite disturbingly low railings. If there'd been a crush of people, I mean, this was really scary.
Yeah.
And then we finally it was way, way further from that elevator bank to the emergency exit stairs, which was out in one of the turrets. So not even part of the main entrance. So you go round the atrium, out into the turret, and then it's in the middle there. And in this kind of very claustrophobic stairwell, sort of imagining the smash of the glass and the mixing of a certain type of acid, which acts as an activating agent for powdered chlorine. So it has to be, you can't just dump powdered chlorine and have it turn into something. You need to take some considerable chemical steps in order to create the gas. And so that meant 2 glass containers smashed together so that the liquid acid mixed with the powdered chlorine and aerosolized it. And that was the moment where I found myself thinking to myself, okay, it is no longer plausible that this could have been an accident. This was an attack, and it took planning, and it took a lot of effort to go to making a device that would do this.
And I know that, the word prank has come up, but as soon as I heard what actually happened, I was, thinking this isn't funny or even remotely in the realm of what I would consider a prank. So could you tell us what happened once that chemical agent reached the area where everyone was at?
So it was immediately spreading into the parts where there were rooms. There's people in all these rooms. So people sound the alarm pretty quickly. Someone pulls the fire alarm pretty quickly after the gas starts to spread, because it's unbearable amounts of gas. I mean, people tried to get to the emergency exit and couldn't get within several dozens of feet of it. The first responders on the scene had to be in full hazmat gear in order to get to the door. People got trapped in rooms. Several people got trapped on the balcony of some rooms, which was the only way they could get to some air. If those rooms hadn't had balconies, for example, that would have been, truly disastrous. In some ways, it was really kind of a lucky escape that more people weren't hurt and that people weren't killed. This could really have gone a lot worse than it did. But people fled outside. People were kind of arranged in the car park in this, as I'm sure you can imagine, truly bizarre scene. People in these gorgeous, detailed animal costumes with the lights of the emergency vehicles kind of standing around outside trying to figure out what's going on. And one of the details in the show was that they were moved into the convention center across the road where a dog show was being held, like a kennel club show. So there's all these animal costumes and then all these crates of all these pedigree dogs kind of barking. Truly extraordinarily strange scene. And then the ambulances were there and people were being carried out in severe respiratory distress, because that's what chlorine does, is it attacks and burns the inside of your lungs and can cause serious long-term damage, and a certain amount of exposure can cause death. So people were taken to a whole bunch of area hospitals. And then the thing that, so we skipped one step, but the thing that happened straight afterwards was that the media covered it like it was a joke. Mm-hmm. And there's one just truly staggering piece of footage from Morning Joe, so MSNBC, the following day, where Mika Brzezinski, the presenter, gets told what furries are and just cracks up laughing while trying to get the words out of 19 people hospitalized in an attack. I mean, it's a extraordinary piece of film.
It was chilling to hear the audio from it.
Yeah. And I don't blame her kind of necessarily. It was a sign of quite lazy reporting, but that's, I think, how a lot of people respond to the idea of furries. And that's how a lot of people have responded to us in learning that we're doing this story is, oh, that's hilarious. Like, what a funny prank on a kind of hilarious group of people. And to me, and I've been covering internet subcultures and communities for a long while, what happens in internet communities is important because it can show what's happening in the rest of society. And if furries have a alt-right, far-right problem in 2014, that really presaged what was quite soon going to happen to the rest of American political society.
More after this. And now, back to the show. It is just such a strange story that has these elements that people could find comedic, but taken all together, it just, I don't know, it loses that pretty quickly. It loses like this quirkiness that people might be attracted to like pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting to me is the first time I ever met or became friends with a furry was back in 2008 when I was in undergrad, and I would sit out in the common area of where my dorm was at night, sometimes kind of late. And so would this person, and we would just get to talking, and, I would ask him all kinds of questions. And, I just was like, whoa, this is so interesting. I've never heard of this. He would tell me about how his persona was a wolf. So he'd tell me about how he would dream almost exclusively as a wolf. And I was just like, this is so, so fascinating. And he was so kind. And we just had this really like sweet relationship that kind of only existed in this, enclosed space of the dorm hall. So I don't know, I guess back in 2000, and I should say one day he showed up wearing his fursuit and I was like, holy shit, this is like like you said, this is an incredible piece of craftsmanship. And, the thing I love the most, and this is getting very specific, was that there was a mechanism that would attach onto his face that would allow him to actually move the mouth the same way that he was speaking. And I was just like, that blew me away too. And it was just a lot of fun to get to know him. And then, but what I think is interesting is that was all the way back in 2008. So this was brand new to me. This attack happened in 2014, but it doesn't seem like I want to say almost moral panic about furries started more recently. What I'm thinking in my head right now is the moral panic that kids are using litter boxes in their school bathrooms. God. I know. It's one of the worst moral panics.
Well, the kind of bleak backstory to that particular one. So there was this whole thing about kids are identifying as animals, and woke school teachers are putting litter boxes in classrooms so that kids who identify as cats can use them. And obviously, as I said, being a furry is not about identifying as an animal. Like you don't have to go to the loo in a litter box if you're a furry. That's not what it's about. But the bleak coda to it was that, upsettingly, I can't remember which journalist did the actual great work digging through this, but it was found that there had been a couple of instances of teachers putting buckets in classrooms for kids to use, but they were there for the purpose of mass shooting lockdowns.
Oh.
They were so that kids could go to the bathroom while on lockdown, where they might be on lockdown for hours. So yeah, USA.
Wow, that is incredibly bleak.
Isn't it? It's just
I had no idea. It's like, it feels like almost the opposite thing that's happening, right? It's like, instead of being like, wow, how sad is it that we have such a problem in this country that we need buckets in classrooms, versus like, oh, the woke left, getting so out of control that children are identifying as animals, which I think also has always been their weird narrative around queerness, right? It's like, well, it's going to end with everyone, marrying a goat or something, and just kind of going into this like return to the animalistic. I guess that's why once I started listening to the podcast, I'd heard about what it was about. And in my head, I placed it in a very different time. I placed it in, 2020, maybe 2021, when this was maybe more in the zeitgeist and less of just a unknown subculture to kind of the mainstream. So what was happening in that culture in 2014 that you think could have, and I don't want to say led to this attack as if it, is the fault of the community, but what do you think was the general tenor and opinion of those inside and outside that you think could have led to something like this happening?
So one of the things that going into it, I had thought was that the furry community was politically unipolar. Like it is a queer-friendly community that was basically kind of all on the same page politically. And the furry community is huge and contains multitudes. It had a growing alt-right fringe within it. So what was surprising was I had assumed that what we'd been looking at was kind of far-right, alt-right trolls, the kind of 4chan trolls, who I've reported on a whole bunch before, attacking a queer-friendly community. And actually what we found is that it was much more complicated than that within furrydom had its own alt-right of furries. The thing that absolutely just twisted my noodle was the idea that there were not Nazis versus furries, but that there were people in the furry community who were Nazis, but also not insincere in their furrydom. So there were whole separate conventions set up to cater for the further right of the furry community. And I don't want to give too much away about the show, but it's end up in this really bizarre, twisty story of these communities within the communities and how they interacted and how they fought. And, because a fucking course he is. Milo Yiannopoulos gets involved at one point.
Yeah, it wouldn't be 2014, 15, 16 without him.
Just can't escape that dude. Yeah. But there's this group called the Furry Raiders who are pretty much explicitly Nazi furries who we discover were involved and linked and had some links to a lot of the personalities that we've been looking at. So yeah, there was an element of the call was coming from inside the house to a certain extent.
I know about the alt-right Nazi furry, small subset for sure. I've seen things about that before. Did you talk with or go to any of these types of alt-right conventions or gatherings?
No, we didn't get to go to them. There haven't been any in a while because there was a pretty serious backlash in the post-Trump era. A lot of them have gone to ground. A lot of the time when you report on the far right and the alt-right, they're pretty leery of talking to the media because they know what they are. They know how the game is played. The big schism happened in Colorado, the Colorado Rocky Mountain FurCon. That got taken over by an alt-right furry group, by the Furry Raiders, who block booked a whole lot of rooms and kind of destroyed the convention that way. They set up their own spin-off one. There aren't actually that many of the alt-right furries. There's not enough to sustain their own convention, really. But we met and spoken to a whole bunch of them individually. And it's like talking to right-wing parts of any subculture, right? I mean, take gaming, for example. Gaming contains all political multitudes, but there are a core of far-right kind of political activists within gaming as a fandom and as a community. And I think that's a good metric to look at the furry fandom by as well. It's a fandom like games that contains things in that way.
Certainly. And I mean, any subculture, I feel like, is going to have that component, barring some that it wouldn't make sense for. But I don't think it's surprising at all, nor is it reflective of anything, any kind of specific problem to the furry community.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's a problem of the internet.
Yes.
Right. It's a problem of the communication infrastructure that means that fringe extremists of any stripe in any context can find each other and form kind of micro communities in a way that just wouldn't have been possible before that. And so you end up with these unique groups of extremist viewpoints within a lot of other communities that just wouldn't have existed before in that same way. And so you see that with everything. You see that with Gamergate as a huge example of that. And in some ways, Trump and MAGAism could not have existed without the internet as a staging post and megaphone for these kind of ideas.
Yeah, there's no way that anything would have gone the way that it has without the social media and message boards.
I found myself saying the other day, my whole career has been as a reporter, reporting on the internet. All of my work is digital. If there was a big red button in front of me right now that would just nuke the entire internet and make it so that nothing like it could ever exist again, I would smack that button so hard. I think this kind of communication infrastructure has been a net negative for civilization. And sometimes it's felt in my career like I'm reporting on a natural disaster mid-explosion.
That's a great way to put it. I completely understand what you mean. So how did the people that you met or the people that you spoke to in some capacity or what you've learned, like how did furries in general deal with these subsets of alt-right furries?
Quite well, to be honest. Mm-hmm. In some ways, the furry community has been an object lesson in how to deal with a rising troll alt-right group within them. Mm-hmm. Which is, to a certain extent, just ignore them. Allow them to blow themselves out. It's always going to exist, but you don't have to get upset by it. The worst thing you can do with a troll is engage, right?
Right.
That's just exactly what they're trying to achieve. The problem with that is, and this is what we ran into when we're reporting this story, is that they've oversteered so hard away from that in this instance, where there was a legitimate and we use the phrase terrorist attack because
Yeah.
You know, how else do you describe a chemical weapon being let off at a convention? A lot of people had that approach even to this, which was, oh, you know, it's not engaged. It's not worth getting upset about, not worth looking into. Let sleeping dogs lie. So there's almost too much of that. But I think the instinct is a relatively healthy one to just sort of let the trolls burn themselves out. But then sometimes they don't.
Yeah, do not feed the trolls.
Yeah.
Yes. And I recently learned that the original meaning of troll was trolling.
Yeah.
Like when you're fishing and you're, you know, dragging the line, trying to catch something and get a reaction, which of course I just thought it was, you know, look at this mean troll under the bridge.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. It is exactly what you're talking about. This, once you give them any attention or any outrage, then they've kind of won at their game, unfortunately.
It could be better described as attention fishing. It's attention fishing. That's what trolling fundamentally is.
Yeah. Yeah. So back to this actual event that happened and this attack. What was the reaction? Like once the dust settled after this attack, like how did the community react, respond, and, you know, maybe the next year deal with a new risk? What was the fallout, you know, in the early days, months, years after this happened?
So kind of not much, really. There is this furry blogger, this guy Patcho Fur, who again, shout out, has done incredible work. He was one of the few people who were consistently taking this seriously. A lot of people, even to this day, 9 years later, and even though the overwhelming evidence is that this can't have been the case, people thought it was either an accident or a prank and just sort of moved on from it in a way that I think is quite well identified as a trauma response to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't think about it. Clearly, the authorities and the media aren't taking it seriously. So what benefit is there to us in taking it seriously? The convention's still held in the same place. It went ahead the following year, same as always. And yeah, people just sort of moved on. I think partly because they didn't feel like they had any choice from moving on. They knew that it wasn't going to be taken seriously.
Yeah. What
benefit would there have been in getting upset about that? They're used to being ridiculed and mocked and not taken seriously. Why would this be any different?
Yeah. More after this. And now, back to the show. And this attack was using chlorine gas, which we haven't yet said, and I believe you say this in the series, is a weapon of war. Is that right?
It's not just a weapon of war. It's a weapon that's banned by every convention of war since World War I. It was used by the Germans in World War I, famously. And, you know, there's we talk about in the show the war poem Dulce et Decorum Est, which describes the effect of this gas coming through the trenches and nobody knew what to do. Burned people's eyes, it burned people's lungs. People would essentially drown from the inside. And the list of people who've used chemical weapons on civilians is a pretty solid list of baddies. I mean, you're talking Bashar al-Assad used it, Saddam Hussein used it on his own people. Use of chlorine gas is a war crime.
Yeah.
And actually, chemical weapons is one of the first things you think of with the phrase war crimes. It's a truly evil thing to do. And now we're not talking state levels of deployment. Mm-hmm. The equipment for this was not made by a military contractor. But the principle of it is the same. It's a killing weapon for which there is no defense, for which all you can do is run and get out the way. And if you're caught in it, then it destroys your lungs from the inside. I mean, it's horrifying.
Which is why it's also just so incredibly scary that this person or people, whoever committed this act, are probably out walking around with the ability to do this again, perhaps to other communities too.
Yeah. I mean, not probably, certainly. There was never anyone caught or charged. So somewhere out there, and not to spoil too much, but we think we've got a pretty good idea of where, is somebody who did this and has never faced any consequences for it.
So just as like a last question. I'm curious about where you started with your knowledge, with your, with your vision, with your idea of the furry community, and if you had any of your preconceived notions changed through actually spending all this time at conventions and with people who identify as furries and people who live this lifestyle.
So as I said, being an internet reporter for a long time, I was already pretty familiar with the furry community. I've got some good friends within the community. I've experienced the kind of online spaces. But from the very beginning, we wanted to be clear that we were approaching as guests to this space. We were there. We wanted very much not to be tourists, not to be kind of gawping and not to be taking the piss in that kind of way.
Yeah.
And it was a very uphill struggle to convince people that that's not what we're trying to do, because they've been burned so much before.
Yeah.
Time and time again, there have been magazine articles that have basically just been, look at these freaks.
Mm-hmm.
There was even, so the title of the show, Fur and Loathing, is controversial because it was also the title of a CSI episode that similarly portrayed furries in this kind of both hideous and completely inaccurate light. And so that's what we were trying to reclaim and say, we're going to report on this subculture the way any subculture, whether it's, and I tried to do that, whether I'm reporting on, I don't necessarily want to compare it directly to a religion, but any cultural group, sports fandom, ideological group, to give them the respect of being taken seriously for what they are and to take their life experience seriously. And that was our sort of starting point. And we had a lot of help from people within the fandom who we spoke to, and then they were kind enough to vouch for us with others. But it was slow, painful going to earn the trust of this community. And I hope that the show does that justice.
I mean, from what I've heard so far, I feel like it does. And I'm already learning, more than I previously have known, just even getting a picture of what it was like doing your reporting, right? Because that's part of what's so fun about investigative podcasts like yours, is that it does sort of feel like you're being brought along to these events. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I think, I don't know how it's all going to play out. I know you don't want to share that with us, but I will encourage everyone to listen to your show, Fur and Loathing. And I know that, the story is unraveling for you into this very moment, which it won't be when the episode comes out.
Yeah, it's still a live one at point of speaking. But we've got to the point where I think we certainly, this feels weird to say, but we're pretty confident we know more than the FBI, certainly the last time we know of what the FBI knows. We're ahead of anything that's out there currently in terms of our theory of the case. And I think we're getting to the point where we can really move this story forward and hope to come up with a reasonably satisfying answer. Now, whether that leads to anything, who knows?
Yeah, and as I said, I think that's for season 2.
That is for season 2.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Nicky, and for making this podcast. I think it's just such a important thing to do, and to give kind of some respect, enough respect to investigate, a terrorist attack against a community feels, like this should have been solved a long time ago. But I'm glad that you're working on it, and I'm glad to hear that it sounds like it isn't entirely forgotten by authorities, but sometimes it takes a podcaster.
Thank you so much. And this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Nicky. This has been so fun for me too. This was American Hysteria. Make sure you subscribe to Fur and Loathing wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support our show and help us continue on, as well as get ad-free episodes and bonus content, you can head to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. you'll get access to Hysteria Home Companion, the other podcast I do with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories that were either cut from the episodes or stories that we know that you'll love. So just head to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. It's a great way to show your support for our show. You can also head to AmericanHysteria.com to get some of our merch or to leave us a message on our Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up, and we might do a whole investigation about it. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler, and our associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith. And I'm your host, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great week.